One scene I've never been able to leave alone. A man does 10 years. 10. He gives up nobody. He walks out in 1999 with his mouth shut and his name clean, which is supposed to be the only thing in that world you actually get to keep. About a year later, his own boss sits down with the man's nephew over lunch and says 5 words. Your uncle was a rat. I spent years thinking that was the stupidest thing Tony Soprano ever said. Let me lay it out, because the details matter here. Richie April got arrested in August of 1989. 10 years, almost certainly federal. Off the heroin operation he'd been running with his brother Jackie and Beansy Gaeta. Beansy skated. Richie ate the whole decade. That's how we meet him. That's the entire character in one image. A guy walking out of a cage he sat in for 10 years without complaining about it once. And he comes home in the fall of '99 to a world that moved on without him. Jackie's dead. Tony Soprano, who's younger than him and used to answer to him, is running the family now. New rules. New boss. A boss he can't bring himself to respect. So Richie digs in. He puts Beansy in a wheelchair in a parking lot. He starts moving cocaine on the family's garbage routes with Junior backing him, after Tony tells him to knock it off. And then he goes looking for somebody to help him kill Tony. He asks Albert Bariz. Albert says no. He asks Junior, and Junior does the math. Richie can't sell it, nobody respects him, and goes straight to Tony. Tony brings it to Silvio, and Silvio's red takes about 4 seconds. Nothing left to gain by keeping Richie breathing. The order goes out. And it never has to happen. Because that same night, Richie's at the dinner table in Livia's house, arguing with Janice about whether his son is gay, and he punches her in the mouth. She leaves the room, comes back with a gun, and puts 2 in his chest. Christopher and Furio take what's left of him to Satriali's. And everybody who wasn't in that room gets a story. Richie went into the program. Here's the case I used to make, loudly, to anyone who'd sit still for it. You rat to stay out of prison. Nobody rats after he's already out. Flipping is a trade. Names for years. If Richie was ever willing to make that trade, he had 10 years of chances. 10 years of people walking into a visiting room with a pen and an offer. He said no every single time. So I'm supposed to believe that the second he's free, no charges, no clock running, nothing on the table, that's the moment he burns everybody? In exchange for what? And forget the arithmetic for a second. Think about the man. Richie's whole personality is the code. He's the one guy in the room who thinks the code is real. It's why he's insufferable. It's why he's dangerous. And it's the last thing on earth he'd ever put up for sale. The show even hands you a control group, and I love that it does. Feech Lamana, same generation, same stubbornness, same allergy to the new guard. Convicted in '84, 20 years, and he served all 20 without ever opening his mouth. That was the whole point of doing it that way. You take the years because you're not a witness. And here's the detail that gets me. Feech and Richie have history. When a young Tony Soprano and Jackie April robbed Feech's card game, Feech wanted them both dead. Richie was one of the capos who stood up at that sit-down and talked him out of it. Richie saved Tony's life. Hold on to that. We're coming back to it. And if you want the argument made better than I can make it, go watch Reservoir Dogs. Nice Guy Eddie says the same thing about Mr. Blonde. Caught in a warehouse full of hot goods, could have walked out clean. All he had to do was give up one name. Instead, he ate 4 years and never took a deal, no matter what they waved in front of him. And now he's home, and the crew is making good on everything they promised him. And he decides out of nowhere to rob them? Eddie won't hear it. Tell me what really happened. That was my whole position. On the list of men who'd ever flip, Richie is at the bottom of it. I was wrong. Doing the time once tells you exactly one thing. It tells you that on one particular day, this guy ran the numbers and liked the answer. Look at what Richie actually bought with that decade. He bought a reputation and a ticket back in. He ate 10 years because standing in the life, coming home and still being somebody, was worth more to him than being free. Now make him run the numbers a second time. He's 10 years older. He's had a taste of the street again. And what did the ticket back in get him? A boss he can't stand? A crew that watched him get slapped down in public? A coup that collapsed with everybody whispering about it? This is a man so far past loyalty and chain of command that he tried to have his own boss murdered. That's the ceiling on his devotion. He'll kill Tony, but he'd never talk to a federal agent? Somebody show me where that line is. And then I read about Ralph Natal, and I had to put my drink down. Philadelphia. 16 years on drug trafficking and arson, and he never gave up a soul. He'd tell you himself, flat out, he did the 16 because he wasn't going to be a witness. Paroled in 1994, walks out and takes the top of the Philly family. 4 years later, they scoop him up on a parole violation. Then a meth indictment lands on him, and his young underboss, Joey Merlino, cuts him loose, stops taking care of him, takes the chair. In 1999, Ralph Natale became the first American mafia boss to turn government witness. 1999, the same year Richie Aprile walked out of prison. A stand-up guy who did the long bid, came home, got jammed up again, and found out the new generation had no use for him. That's a documented pattern, and it was playing out in the real world at the exact moment somebody was writing Richie. And what's Richie doing with his freedom? Moving coke on the garbage routes. A man home from a dime who catches a narcotics case is looking at 10 to 20 more. At his age, 10 to 20 is a death certificate with extra paperwork. So there's a grain of truth buried in it. There usually is with Tony. That's the craft. But a lie still needs somebody to swallow it. And I finally got that answer out of a completely different room. Season 4, Tony beats Ralph Cifaretto half to death on Ralph's own kitchen floor and finishes it with both hands around his throat. Then he picks up the phone and calls Christopher. Chris turns up late, high on heroin, and finds Tony standing over the body, bloodied, wrecked, still breathing hard. And Tony looks at him and says, "I found him like this." I've watched that scene maybe 30 times, and it took me an embarrassing number of them to hear what's actually going on. Christopher doesn't buy it, not for a second. Chris is stoned out of his mind, and he's still not dumb enough to swallow that. Because nobody calls you in the middle of the night to help clean up a body he happened to stumble across. So why say it at all? Because Tony needs somewhere to stand. That sentence is the ground under his feet. It's the thing he can point at later. And it's the thing that lets Christopher pick up an end of Ralph without ever having to hear his boss say out loud that he killed a captain. Those words carry consequences that do not stop at that kitchen. So Tony puts something else in the air. And what it actually means is, don't ask me, help me. And this is the version that exists now. Carmine runs the same play in The Wait. He walks Tony right up to the edge of it, close enough that Tony has to ask him whether he's saying what he thinks he's saying. And Carmine goes, "I didn't say nothing." Saying it without saying it. That's the language of that entire world. And once you hear it, you can't stop hearing it. So take that back to the lunch at Artie's. Listen to how Tony opens. He tells Jackie straight out that a denial from him would be worthless, that only a shithead would take his word for it. Then he denies it anyway. Then he hands him the rat. That's a boss telling a kid what the record says, and nobody at that table is in any position to say otherwise. Because when a man in that world just evaporates, there are two explanations, and there is no third one. He's dead or he flipped. If he'd been arrested, everyone would know inside a day. So if Richie's gone, and Tony isn't tearing up New Jersey hunting for whoever clipped his own captain, which is what a boss is obligated to do, then the only version that keeps Tony out of the frame is that the guy ran. He tells Jackie so the story stays the same everywhere, forever. He tells Jackie in case the kid's angry enough to try something. And somewhere in there, I think, because he doesn't want his best friend's son knowing he helped bury his uncle. But watch what Tony actually gets out of that lunch. The kid walks out of the restaurant carrying the story. That's the whole transaction. Belief never enters into it. And now the crew has a reason Richie had to go. And the wives have a bedtime story, which is exactly why Richie's in the program instead of in the ground. And that's when the cruelty of it finally landed on me. Appearances are everything to these people. Legacy is everything. It's the only afterlife any of them actually believe in. The version of you that gets told at the table after you're gone. So look at what Richie ends up with. Shot by his own fiancée over an argument about ballroom dancing. Cut apart in the back of a pork store, and then his name gets welded, permanently, to the single worst thing a man in his life can be called. The one thing 10 years of silence proves he wasn't. 10 years to build a name, 5 words to take it. And here's what makes this more than a plot hole to me. Richie believed. Feach believed. Feach did his 20 and never said a word. And Tony had Christopher and Benny Fazio stash stolen televisions in his garage. And a parole officer turned up the next morning, and Feach went back inside for the rest of his life. The same Feach that Richie once talked out of killing a young Tony Soprano. Tony preaches the code constantly. Honor, this thing of ours. Respect. And the two men who actually lived by it are the two men he destroys. One branded a rat forever. One framed and shipped back to a cell to die in. He wore the code like a costume and used it as an alibi, and I don't think he believed a syllable of it. and he came by it honestly, which is the part that gets under my skin. In Camelot, Tony works out that his father's beautiful mistress is a hustler, running him for a payout. He knows. You can watch him know. And then he goes right back to the guys and retells all her glamorous stories anyway. Same episode gives you a flashback of Johnny Boy making his teenage son lie to Livia to cover the affair. Johnny Boy taught that kid to lie before he taught him anything else. That's the inheritance. Everybody remembers the jacket. Livia had it right. It's all a big nothing. So, I was wrong about that scene for years. It's a bad lie. Tony never needed a good one. Richie spent 10 years buying the only thing that world swears nobody can take from you, and Tony took it over a lunch he didn't even finish. Now I want to hear from you, because I've already changed my mind on this once. If Richie gets pinched on that coke, no coup, no Janice, just 10 to 20 staring him down at his age. Does he stay stand up? Or does he do exactly what Ralph Natali did? Make your case in the comments. Be specific. I read them.